Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So as a piece of that, our goal each week is to bring you something that's hopeful and helpful. So subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.
Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Community Church podcast. If you find today's episode hopeful and helpful, then please follow or subscribe, and then rate and review so that more people can find the conversation. I've been sharing that in the upcoming weeks, we'll be doing a Q&A with the lead pastor of the Ridge, Mark White, where you can ask any question. Well, this is the last week to send in your questions, so make sure that you do that either by following the link in the show notes, or if you're listening in through YouTube, you can ask a question by just adding a comment to this video. Now for today's episode, we actually don't have a podcast guest. Instead, I'm going to be sharing some things with all of you that I've learned over the last 2 years hosting this podcast. Last week was actually the 100th interview that I've gotten to do for the podcast. And it just seemed like a cool opportunity to take a second. And, well, first of all, just thank all of you who've been listening to all the conversations that we've had. My hope is that you've enjoyed them, you've been inspired, and you've learned just as much as I have been able to over the last couple of years. I also just want to share some of the cool things that I've been able to witness and pick up while I've been doing these interviews. In no way do I claim to be a master podcast host, but hopefully some of these thoughts will be hopeful and helpful for you today. I think I have to start with all the amazing guests that I've been able to talk to and have conversations with. You know, they kind of break into a couple of different categories. You know, there's people who have just spent a great deal of time and energy to learn and master a craft or a skill or to be a leader or gain knowledge in a specific way, like a historian or a counselor or something like that. And the cool thing about those individuals, to me, is just how willing they are to have conversations and share what they've learned through the years that they've been doing what they've been doing. And a lot of us know individuals that are in these different career paths, you know, that they have an expertise on a certain topic and they love and are willing to share and talk about it. And so, you know, one of my big takeaways for anybody listening, right, is be willing to ask questions and learn and grow from those people that you interact with, that are your friends, that have expertise in a different area, and ask them questions about, you know, what is it about that field that's interesting to them? What have they learned about doing in that field? And as you kind of grow that conversation, you can figure out how it applies to your own life. Some fields, obviously, they may be more natural to the current things that you're facing and the struggle that you're going through, right? If you're in business and you're talking to a business leader, right, your questions are probably going to be geared more towards that craft. Or if you want to ask some therapy related questions, and if you're talking to somebody who is a therapist or a counselor, and you have a friend that you know, you can talk to them about, hey, how have they seen the value of their field help people? You know, you just gain those bits of conversations with people, and people are willing to share that. In my experience, people love the chance to share the things that they're interested in and the things that they have spent so much time working on. I also think what's really, really fascinating with all the different guests that we've been able to have on the podcast is that, you know, it's not just the experts, it's not just the masters of a specific field that we can learn and grow from. It's really anybody who's been able to have conversations with people and experience things in their life, experience challenges. And when they start to tell their story to you, you start to see the places where they have grown. The time that you can ask them questions of, hey, what's the best piece of advice you've gotten? And that's just such a great question to ask people, because you know, everyone's going to have their own unique perspective, but you're also opening your wisdom branch up to whatever they've been able to gather in their life, you know? And so as you're talking with your friends, as you're talking with coworkers, as you're meeting people, asking them questions about their story and their experience, and you can get some really cool takeaways from people's stories and the things that they've gone through. Right. I love, just in a recent conversation, talking with a couple that shared, you know, they made a point to ask and seek the wisdom of people that were in a life stage ahead of theirs. And that's just such a huge, important thing, because it wasn't like this couple that was the next stage ahead of them had this degree in parenting. They didn't have this master's thesis of like what it meant to have a healthy marriage, but they had the experiences and the things that they had gone through in their life, and they'd had the conversations with each other. They'd learned hard lessons. And so to be able to recognize in yourself that, man, people have this wisdom and they have these experiences that I can also learn and grow from. And it doesn't have to be me listening in on a podcast. It doesn't have to be me seeking out this through YouTube or through all these different channels. It can be just having these conversations when I'm with my friends, having these conversations with people that maybe I meet in a Ridge group if you're part of one. And you can grow by just having those conversations and learning from their experiences and the questions they've asked. And I think part of that is figuring out, who are the individuals that I would really love to grow from. And that's a part of the conversation. But I think that really what I've learned from all the guests is that everybody has things that they've learned and experiences that they've gone through that we can grow and learn from. Even if somebody has a different perspective than you, even if somebody has a different viewpoint than you do, you can still learn and grow from what they're sharing, even if it's a different perspective from your own that lets you understand how people think that you as you're interacting with them. And there's just a tremendous amount of value in that. The other cool thing about all the different guests that I've been able to chat with is that you start to notice that there's like these consistent themes that people will have. And it's really fun to talk to people who are growing in their faith journey. And there are certain key things that I just pick up in their stories over and over and over again. And this isn't me trying to sell you on any of these steps in your faith, but it is me saying that it is very interesting to me that there are certain things that people do on their faith journey that are really, really helpful for them. And when they consistently get brought up by people in discovering, hey, just growing in their own faith, I take notice. One of those things really is being in a group of people that, have the same faith and having conversations and having people that will hold you accountable. That has been a consistent theme that I've seen, is people being willing to hold you accountable, being able to have conversations with people in a group where you have this community element. Multiple guests have mentioned that, and it's kind of funny because they'll mention it in kind of an offhanded way, and oh yeah, as part of a group, but there's like this consistent theme of that being present. One of the other ones really is serving and seeing how people's faith grew when they were serving, or seeing how they started to take steps in their faith journey by serving. And that really propelled them more into like with their connection with God. I do think that you hear enough about the stories of people learning and growing through serving that you start to take notice. So that's been one of those themes that I've seen people share. With regards to relationships, man, it always just seems to come back to communication. And that's not just with marriage relationships or dating relationships, but also with parents with their kids' relationships. Learning and growing in your ability to communicate with others and to not only accurately communicate what you are trying to communicate, but to actively interpret and figure out what the other person is trying to communicate. And being willing for both parties to be able to grow in that, and having, even, it sounds silly, but having conversations, communicate about how you communicate. And that's like just this consistent theme that I've been able to see and notice with people as they're sharing their kind of experiences in marriage and in relationships. And from the side of parenting, it's been to see how parents will use moments to communicate. So what I mean by that is I've heard a lot about, like, there'll be teachable moments. They'll figure out, hey, how do I communicate this rule or this principle with my children so that this conversation with them brings them into it. And yes, as a parent, what you say goes. but also that communication piece allows that relationship and that understanding for them to grow in a different way besides just following a rule or an order, but for them to internalize what they're going through. Yeah, so communication, just this consistent theme amongst the guests that I've been able to talk to. One other element that's really fascinating for me when it comes to themes about what guests have in common is that they're oftentimes very thoughtful about their experiences. What I mean by that is most of them have taken a second or a chance to really think about what they went through. Think about a hardship, think about a journey, think about a serving experience that they had, and not just let it pass them by, but they've like consciously had conversations with people about it. And I think that is one way of thinking through something, is to talk it through with people. That's where some of those groups and faith building friends elements comes in, I think. But I do think that there is this common theme of like this reflection that allows them to grow and not repeat, I think, some of the mistakes or the positive things that have happened. And it's that reflection that lets them grow. It's that reflection and talking it through with somebody, or taking some moment and being prayerfully talking to God about some of these elements. And when they do that, it allows them, one, to be podcast guests and talk about it because they iterate it really well. But two, I think it lets it stick in your mind really, really powerfully. Like if you experience something and then forget you experienced it, or forget the lesson that you learned from it, it's hard to grow. But when we remember those things, then it's really impactful and important to us. And then we can make those changes based off of that. The last theme that I'll mention is just that God continues to show up in people's stories and in their lives in some really cool and unique ways. You know, I've gotten a chance to hear some really cool things of redemption. I've gotten to hear how God has given people the strength to do some really courageous things, whether that's in moments of coming to faith in places like Ukraine, or different elements where, you know, they've been able to have healed marriages and relationships, or been able to experience forgiveness and the removal of bitterness from that, where God has just shown up and made a tremendous and incredible impact in people's lives. You know, and I think that's some of the hope that, you know, we talk about at the Ridge, that our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. And I think that's some of just the hope that you experience with Jesus. And it's cool to consistently hear stories about how that's playing out in other people's lives, and how that's a theme, how people have this faith because God's real and he does incredible things, and he brings people hope, and he brings people joy, and he gives them strength, and he calls them to himself and helps them live out a purpose and redeems relationships. And it's just a cool honor to be able to hear people's stories. And, you know, we have our own experiences and our own reasons maybe why we've come to faith, or maybe some of you listening haven't yet. And it's cool to hear how other people have experienced that incredible God show up in their life. And so, yeah, my hope is that when you hear some of these conversations and you hear about what God has done and what God is doing in people's lives, that is an encouragement that he's active and he's real and he's doing stuff in their lives. It means he can do the exact same things in your life. So hopefully that's an encouragement for you today. I also want to take a second and not just necessarily talk about the things that guests have shared with me, and like the kind of the takeaways that I've gotten from that, but also just how I've learned by talking to guests, and what I've learned by like interviewing through them. What I mean by that is that you see individuals and you talk with individuals that they don't necessarily, like I mentioned before, they don't necessarily have this expertise in this area, but they have these life experiences. And they have what I call this perspective that is unique to them. And it's really fascinating to hear the different and unique perspectives, and to consistently see the cool ways that God uses them in their story and provides value to others through them. And it kind of just continually shows you how God has uniquely made every person inherently valuable, and how they each have their own unique gifts and perspectives and ways they see the world that even if there are times where you don't agree with them, that like they represent a way that you can grow in your understanding of how somebody's life and how the differences in their life can kind of impact your understanding of how the world works, of how God can show up in people's stories and the things that God does. You know, people will notice different characteristics about God than I do. And areas of faith in God where it might not be natural for me to make a connection, I've had guests make those connections. And it's really cool to see that, because I think that's a cool depiction of how a church, how people, when you have conversations with other people of faith, can help you grow. Because those conversations like show you that God isn't one-dimensional or one-sided, but there's just so many different ways that we can look at what God is doing. And when you hear people talk about that and some of the excitement that they have with it, that enthusiasm can be really contagious and help you grow in your own faith journey. So that's been really cool. I think that, you know, if you right now, maybe you're hearing some of this and you're like, gosh, I don't know if my story has value. I don't know if my perspective really means anything. I want to challenge you on that, because I think that your perspective is valuable. Like the way that you've experienced life, the way that you've gone through life. Like my hope is that you would see your own story as valuable, and you would see the people that you interact with as being really valuable as well. And that you know that their perspective is important, your perspective is important, and you can utilize your story and the things that you've gone through and the things that you've faced. When you're willing to share some of those things, that can be incredibly helpful to somebody as they're growing in their faith journey. And I think one of the really cool areas that I feel like I've been able to grow and develop in like my own personal skills is figuring out how do I ask questions that are good, right? So that I'm not just like asking questions or boring questions or things that you all want to hear and you all want to listen to, but also that I'm asking questions in a way that is consistently honoring to the person that I'm interviewing. And I think that's something that I think translates to real life too. Right? To where if we envisioned a conversation as though we're trying to honor the person with our questions and we're trying to grow and learn through our conversation, I think that really does shift how we might ask questions, how we might engage in conversations with somebody, because then it's like there's this curiosity that we want to have, right? Where it's how has their life, like what's the meaning behind some of the things that have happened to them? And how can I ask questions in a way that kind of show and highlight maybe the growth that this person went through, but also the really cool things that they were able to learn and grow from. And I think that's been an area where I've really tried to lean into and learn how to ask questions that help somebody kind of talk through some of their journey, but also like showcases it in a really impactful light, right? So I think that when somebody shows interest, when somebody is genuinely curious in something that you've gone through, I'll speak for myself. When somebody is curious or generally shows interest in something that I've gone through, I know it makes you want to think through what's happened to me or what I've gone through or what I've learned. And it makes you want to engage with them. And it helps me even like articulate what I'm thinking better, because it shows me that what I went through had value, right? And I think that as I've kind of learned to grow in how I ask questions, there is an element of that I think kind of brings out that I think there's an element in that I hope people feel helps them bring out what they're thinking. It helps them articulate what they're going through. One of the tricks I can give you a couple of the tricks that I use. One of the things is, this sounds silly, be genuinely curious. Right. So as you're talking with somebody and they share something that's interesting to you, you can ask a follow-up question on something. And I think part of making it a good question is you're asking it in a way that is because you're curious, right? So when somebody is sharing with you, or somebody is having a conversation with you about topics that maybe are more mundane, or like you talk about every day, like, I don't know, a classic example might be, we're just chatting about the weather, which is totally fine, right? Obviously small talk has its place. I do think when somebody starts to share, or if you want to, you can ask them questions about things that you're curious about in their life, and developing that natural curiosity for what people have gone through. I think one of the ways you do that is that you see the value in somebody's experiences. And so if wow, I know that this person has had experiences in their life and they've gone through stuff in their life, that's going to be interesting maybe for me because I can learn and grow from it, or just because it's going to show me something about how God is working in their life. There's lots of different areas that you can go through with that, but and then you can ask questions about those things. And then I think it's easy to, if you get into that mode, you can get into like the 20 questions, grill them with questions type of mentality. And I would advise, you can ask questions, but it's also really powerful when you listen intently with what they're saying. And then you can kind of take away some of the themes or meaning from what they're sharing. And you can ask back to them, or even, wow, it sounds like you experienced this. Or I love how you had this takeaway from this experience. And you kind of add to the conversation. You take some of the pressure. It's weird. You can take some of the pressure off the conversation of being like, oh, it's just them on this pedestal of questions that you're asking them in conversation, to it also moves into you're like both invested in this conversation and you're adding to it as well. And so it kind of just makes a conversation flow really naturally. And it's a cool way to just, when you're talking with somebody, kind of hopefully experience like growth, and you can learn from them and gain their perspective through that type of questioning. I think the last thing that I would hope to share, just as we wrap up this podcast here, is that I just want to encourage everybody to be willing to learn and share their story. And I say learn first, because obviously your story, right? But I do think that you almost relearn it when you think about it critically, and you kind of connect some dots about how things worked in your life to make other elements happen, how God showed up in this way. So almost like learn your own story, if that makes sense, and then know and see the points that add value. So look at the places and the points where you grew, and those things can help other people grow. Those things can connect you with other people so that you make greater connections and build greater friendships. And I would just encourage anybody to just be willing to share your story, be willing to share your perspective with people. And that's part of it, right? Where you have those good conversations, you ask those good questions, and then you also can share your side of it. And I think that's where, you make those meaningful connections. We talk a lot about year one here at the Ridge, and investing in that person that you were really hoping will find Jesus and helping them get there. And I do think that this is a super important element of that whole process. Seeing somebody that maybe they don't follow Jesus. And you just take a genuine interest in them and their life and what they've been through, and know that you can grow from their perspective. You can grow from what they've been through in their life and how to handle certain situations. And then also you're going to have an opportunity to share what God has meant in your life, what you can do, how you've experienced the impact that what Jesus has done for you and what he continues to do, and how that can help them going forward. Well, I know this hasn't been a traditional podcast episode, but my hope is that there's something that you can take away and grow and learn from it, and that it will be a hopeful and helpful conversation for you. So thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Podcast. Make sure to follow and subscribe so that you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations. Make sure to ask your questions to Mark White in the link below or in the comments if you're on YouTube, and have a wonderful week.